Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome on just a fabulous, beautiful day in fall. It's again our great pleasure to have with us Bruce Douglas. Before I go into his introduction and a few requests for making sure the broadcasting goes well, I would like just to share with you a meditation that comes from the experience of yet another week. This is by Stephen Charleston, who was an Indigenous elder. Love will not lose, even when the evidence of the daily news seems to suggest that it will. Even if we despair of the values we thought we shared, even if we imagine the divisions between us have grown too wide, love will not lose. Love cannot be constrained by legal walls, political pieties, or institutional fear. Love is the subversion of power by mercy. It is the uncontrolled spirit of hope that erodes the authority of oppression. Love is the human soul made visible. Once we see it in one another's eyes, no force on earth can compel us to deny its reality, no matter what it takes. No matter how long it takes, love will not lose. And I will also welcome both Denise and David, just to say, join us if you have.
Yeah, that was a perfect prayer, particularly for this week.
Thanks to Denise, actually.
Yeah, well, nothing to add to that. So, other than welcome Bruce again, and
it's great to be with everybody. I will just ask just a couple of things before I get into the program, that if you will make sure that you are muted, so that during the presentation, Bruce will be giving 45 minutes picture message for us to reflect on, and we will respect and expect questions after that, which if you're in the room, hold on to those questions, make sure that you can offer them. And if you're remote, offer them through the chat. Otherwise, and this is the second in a three-part series about reform political thought in the age of catastrophe, 1914 through 45. He will, I will say no more about his message, but it is just such an honor and pleasure to have Bruce with us. He's the founding director emeritus of the Reformed Institute, associate professor director of government, Georgetown University. He has an MDiv from Yale University, PhD in political science from Duke University, and is an elder at Lewinsville Presbyterian Church in McLean, Virginia, and great friend of ours. Say no more. Bruce? Recording is done.
Thank you, Carol. It is my pleasure to be with you folks. We've been doing it for a long time in the fall, usually in September, I believe, and I look forward to these sessions. Just a word about Karl Barth. I'm spending a lot of time in this particular segment, this particular installment of this series of talks on reform political thought on Karl Barth, because he is the giant figure, not just in Reformed theology, but Protestant theology generally in the 20th century. And he made his name in the period that we're talking about here, the age of catastrophe. Carol and I had an exchange during the week about readings. And I just want to mention to you one book which is in print and might interest some of you. One of the things I like about Bradley Hills is that there are actually people in these classes who read books, read serious books. This book is called Against the Stream, and it is the political writings of Karl Barth in the period between 1946 and the early 1950s, a pregnant moment a very pregnant moment in the history of the West and in the history of Reformed Protestantism. So I commend that to you. Against the Stream, Karl Barth, if you're interested, it's a collection of various pieces. The title of this segment of the series I've been developing is The Age of Catastrophe. And the Age of Catastrophe has as dates the 1914 to 1945. It was a period in which terrible things happened to people and there was terrible suffering. It's just to state the obvious. All of you are educated people and you know what I'm talking about. But historians oftentimes characterize this. Some of my favorites characterize it in those terms. Hannah Arendt, for example, characterizes this period as dark times, living in dark times. Now, that's very similar to some of the other people who talk about the age of catastrophe. In focusing on Barth, as I will be doing in the second half of this presentation, I want to just note that he is one of several figures who could easily be held up for your attention. He's a representative figure, but by far the preeminent figure. Some of the other names that are commonly listed in this group of people are Emil Brunner, a Swiss theologian like Barth was, Martin Niemöller, the great leader of the Confession Church movement, and the Niebuhr brothers, Reinhold Niebuhr, Richard Niebuhr. They were all of this same mind and contributed to a developing current of thought, which came to be particularly influential in the aftermath of the Second World War. It dominated the mainline seminaries. I went to Yale, and when I went to Yale in the late 60s, it was clearly dominated by the thought of Karl Barth. Now, this suffering and terrible things that happened was related to certain very specific causes, one of which was war. And I talked about that last time. 2 wars, 2 world wars, terrible suffering, terrible evil done, as Barth would say. Today, I want to talk about something which is related to that, but different. This was also a period in which radical ideologies came to the forefront and made a profound impact upon public affairs. Radical ideologies. And I'll define that in just a second. So this is an age of, sometimes historians of political thought characterize this as an age of ideology. And it was an age of a very particular kind of ideology. The word ideology, as I'm using it here, is a byproduct, the meaning that I'm giving to it here is a byproduct of mass politics. Let me say that again. A byproduct of mass politics. Even though the word sometimes is used very loosely to refer to other times and place, this really was a product of developments that took place in the 19th and the 20th centuries that gave rise to mass movements, mass politics. And ideology had a couple of functions in that regard. I'm not saying this is the reason it arose, but it certainly contributed to the dynamics of mass politics in a couple of different ways. The first was to provide a set of ideas and ideals that could be aspirational in public life, a set of ideas and ideals that could be aspirational in public life, giving people something to stand for, and that becomes a very important part of the logic of ideologies, giving people a cause. I think we fail to appreciate the extent to which that's what happened in this period, that a set of political ideas and ideals became causes that people were willing to sacrifice and even die for. So that's part of it. But the other part is organization of the electorate into blocks, organization of the electorate into blocks. And in this period, you have the emergence of these isms. You didn't have isms before, but the electorate was organized into ideological blocks represented by such forces as liberalism, socialism, nationalism. Important part of it was Christian democracy, conservatism, all of those terms really are products of the 19th and 20th century. Now, one of the most important points I have to make in the beginning part of this presentation is that at the beginning, in the sort of unfolding of mass politics in the 19th and early 20th century, in that period, on the whole, radical ideologies were marginalized. It was a period in which there were all kinds of ferment, to be sure. You had the revolutions of 1830, 1848, 1870s, and so forth. There were these periods of these sort of surges of radicalism. But on the whole, the electorate was attracted to what I would characterize as moderate ideologies, or today sometimes they're characterized as centrist ideologies. Most of the dominant ideologies were centrist, not radical. What does that mean? It means that they were the people who espoused these ideologies, and especially the leaders of these movements with ideological definition, were willing to play by the rules of democratic politics. Play by the rules of democratic politics, meaning they were willing to accept the results of contested elections. They were willing to engage once they sat in parliament, as so many of the representatives of these parties did, in compromise, in collaboration. They took for granted that they were not going to get the whole thing that they wanted. They were going to get a part of what they wanted, but only a part, because they had to work with, in order to form and keep majorities, they had to work with people representing other points of view. Radicals, in contrast, and I think this is, I would go so far as to say this is the definition of radicalism, political radicalism. The radicals were not willing to accept the rules of the system. Indeed, they had contempt for the system. They had contempt for the system, and they wanted to overthrow it. That was their whole point. And they treated the system, the existing political arrangements, as something that should be treated with contempt. And they had nothing but negative things to say about the kind of activity that went on in established democratic institutions. I want to identify three in particular that were in that frame of mind. And if you've done any reading especially the latter part of the political histories of the latter part of the 19th century, you will immediately understand these names. Anarchists played a big role. People who, for one reason or another, were unhappy in a deep way with the current arrangements and wanted to at least disrupt it. Anarchists oftentimes had a difficult time doing anything more than disrupt, but they did disrupt. Then Marxism initially was not radical. I want to stress, was not radical. It was social democratic. Its main movements in the 19th century were social democratic, not communist, not Leninist. And the Social Democrats were very much known for their willingness to play the game, play the democratic game. But once Marxism takes the turn toward what is now known as communism, it becomes radical. It becomes radicalized and has this contempt for. Lenin had nothing but contempt for democratic institutions. And then, of course, also, by definition, radical were the fascists. The fascists made no pretense of accepting the rules of the game. They wanted to overthrow the whole system and replace it with something else. And they were willing, all of these people were willing to do it, to use extra legal means to achieve their ends, oftentimes involving violence. Now, just to summarize, in the period leading up to 1914, the radicals tended to be there, but on the margins. They did not have wide popular following. For example, in the Marxist case, the Social Democrats overwhelmingly had the control and support of the working class. It was only a margin, a fringe element in that world, the working class, the industrial working class, that had any interest in more radical measures. But once 1914 comes, and this is just very important to what I'm saying this morning, once 1914 comes and the war breaks out, and then what follows from the war, this situation that I've been describing has changed fundamentally. The war and the consequences of the war, the ripple effects of the war, have the effect of reversing the equation that I've been discussing. The centrist parties were put on the defensive. They were put on the defensive in part because their own hypocrisy. The Social Democrats, for example, the Marxist-oriented Social Democrats, insisted that they would not support war efforts in 1940 if war broke out. And then, of course, when war broke out, they promptly reversed that position entirely, inviting the contempt of more radicals and giving the radicals a real opportunity to make their case for the corruption of the whole system. So what you find after during the war, but even more after the war, is a surge in radicalism, a surge in communist radicalism, a surge in particular fascist radicalism, and they make an effort to take advantage of the instability that's been created by the war to create disorder, to foment disorder. And as a result of that, it's appropriate to think of the period after the First World War, for a substantial period, perhaps all the way up to the end of the Second World War, as an age of political catastrophe. We talked about military catastrophe last time. Here comes political catastrophe. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, first of all, that the environment that was created by the war and the rather revengeful peace that was imposed on the defeated parties after World War I, created an environment, and the symbol of this, of course, is the great and troubled Weimar Republic in Germany, created a situation in which it was possible for the radicals to subvert normal politics on a regular basis. And so you have a politics in this period of increasing overt violence in domestic affairs, assassinations, riots, informal armies formed. The fascists in particular formed informal armies that were used to foment, to intimidate opponents and foment disorder. So that's the first thing, the subversion of conventional politics, and the subversion of conventional politics had the effect of sowing a great amount of fear and insecurity in ordinary people who were not political. We're sensing that this is a very dangerous situation. There's constant disruption. There's constant violence. There's constant threats of violence, which creates which creates a mood that is really inimical to stable democratic politics. I remember in graduate school reading an essay which didn't really capture well my mind until recently, and that is, it's a famous essay by Hannah Arendt, the great political philosopher, on violence in politics. And she said in that essay, violence is the opposite of democratic politics. Violence is the opposite of democratic politics, because if violence breaks out on any wide scale, all of the things which are important for democratic politics are threatened, especially free debate and honest disagreements, and on and on. She said the more violence you get, the less likelihood there is that democratic processes can function well and normally. The radicals, of course, did not just subvert democratic politics in time in the 1920s and on into the 1930s. They seized power. First, the fascists in Italy, but then eventually the National Socialists in Germany. And that immediately demonstrated very quickly another aspect of their radicalism. Not only were they committed to subverting the existing order, but once they got power, they were interested in using state power to radically change things. And so another part of their project, whether it be the communists who had just seized power in Russia, or the fascists and the National Socialists, their ambition rather clearly was to do whatever they needed to do to achieve a radical makeover of the societies in which they were governing. And that in turn carried to yet another aspect of radicalism in this period, an enormous expansion of state power related to the idea, which really has its source here, not earlier, and that is the idea of totalist politics. Politics takes over everything. It takes over education. It takes over the economy. It takes over even religious life to some extent. One of the characteristics of radical politics is no sense of the limits of politics, but an expansive view of the possibilities of what can be controlled through politics. Totalist politics, totalist ambitions leading to totalitarianism. And that becomes a big theme in the scholarly writing about this period. And then, of course, one other thing about this, which needs to be mentioned because it's really an inherent part of it. It's not just a side issue. In each case, and this is fascinating to observe, there is a scapegoating of some segment of the population which is deemed to be stigmatized as the enemy of the people. In the Nazi case, of course, it's obvious, vicious attack upon Jews and anybody connected with Judaism, including, I might add, Christian converts who came from Jewish backgrounds. In the Russian case, it was the peasantry. The peasantry suffered to enormous pain and suffering and death, great economic losses in the famous collectivization campaign over which Stalin presided in the 1930s. Now, having given you that quick sketch, and believe you me, it could be a longer sketch, that quick sketch of the effects of the triumph of radical ideologies in this period, let me conclude with this observation. It came to a, you might say, climactic end in World War II. It was an episode in Western history which came to a climactic, brutal end, maybe fittingly, you might say, with the dropping of atomic bombs at the end of the Second World War. Now, this had just terrible consequences for the people living through it. How could it be characterized as anything other than catastrophic? Country economies ruined, enormous movement of peoples as refugees, and so on and so forth. But it did have a silver lining, and here I come to another crucial point. The outcome of this was the triumph, as it had never triumphed before, of constitutional democracy. The crescendo to which this set of events that I've been describing came was so catastrophic that it discredited radicalism, for a while at least. It discredited radicalism. If you were teaching a course about the flow of ideas in the 20th century, you would say there was a surge of radicalism, and then as a result of the catastrophic developments, it got a bad name. Radicalism got a bad name, even among those segments of the population who might have previously been attracted to it. And you have now a swing back in the direction of politics in a stable, moderate form. The widespread disapproval of radical ideas, especially radical ideas on the right. Radical ideas on the right were just powerfully discredited by the National Socialism and the war to which it had led. That, on the whole, was discredited. Less so on the left, but in fairness, I want to add, it was only less so because even on the left, there was a very strong discrediting of radical ideas. And you have the emergence of a new appreciation, and it can only be characterized as a fundamental appreciation of the value of constitutional democracy, which is what is behind all the steps that were taken in the aftermath of the Second World War to create a stable democratic order, And also, I would say the steps that were taken in the aftermath of the Second World War to overcome the mistakes, to correct the mistakes that had been made in the aftermath of the First World War. You have the emergence of serious attempts to reconstruct, for example, the countries that had been the enemy in the aftermath of the Second World War. All those reconstruction efforts were directed to what? Enabling those countries, Germany, Italy, and the others, enabling those countries to recover in a wholesome way, and to recover in a way which was compatible with constitutional democratic ideas. You also had this fascinating thing, which we've been reminded of because it seems to be now threatened in significant ways. The emergence of attempts to create a global, or at least an international, economic order that would be conducive to the stable functioning of what I would characterize as mixed economies, combinations of capitalism and high degrees of social regulation by the state, as well as, of course, the creation of large welfare states. And of course, it was clearly recognized that the ability of political actors to control events at all well in the economic sphere required an international economic order. And thus you get the Bretton Woods arrangements that are designed to, again, overcome the mistakes that had been made in not only the First World War, but also the Depression that I'll be talking about next week. And the final thing I want to say is this was highly successful, extraordinarily successful. I had a colleague at Georgetown, now deceased, long deceased, who was on the Council of Economic Advisors in the Eisenhower administration. And I asked him one day, did you guys have any idea that there was going to be over 2 decades of sustained economic growth in the aftermath of the Second World War? He said, we had no idea. We had hopes, but we had no ideas. And frankly, as it happened, it just astonished us. Well, that was a huge advance. Industrial economies, say, recovering their life, recovering their vitality, and being able to produce sustained prosperity, which created middle-class societies really as they had never existed before. And of course, it also brought peace and a high degree of political as well as economic stability. The post-war era is commonly characterized by historians as a kind of return not only to normalcy, but an enormous advance in politics and economics in the direction of well-functioning, stable political and economic institutions. Final thing I want to say about that is, probably all of you have heard the phrase at one point or another, end of ideology. The idea that was espoused in that period, I think it was an exaggeration, but the idea that was espoused in that period was that we've now come to an age in which politics can be pragmatic and all that ideological nonsense can be marginalized. End of ideology. It was a very interesting sort of issue of argument in that period in the aftermath of the Second World War. I think it would be wrong to say that what happened in that period was that ideology itself faded away. What faded away was radical ideology. It was a return to a political situation in which most of the significant ideologically driven forces were prepared to play by the rules of the game. Now, with that as background, let me talk briefly about the Reformed response, and in particular, talk about Karl Barth, who, as I said earlier, is the preeminent figure in really shaping Protestant thought in this period. First thing I want to say about Karl Barth in this context is the following. His political identity at the beginning of his career, he started out as a pastor in a small, middle-sized town that had both industrial workers and agricultural workers, some entrepreneurs, small town, not far from Zurich. And in the beginning of his ministry, he was very concerned about the well-being of the working class in particular. And that meant that he had socialist sympathies. He had socialist sympathies. He was not a communist, but he had socialist sympathies. He was critical of some of the actions taken by entrepreneurs in that period. Thought the situation in which the working class had been put was problematic. So at the beginning, he had a kind of socialist leaning in his politics. Indeed, he was enough of that kind of thinker, critical of capital, appreciative of the critical of capitalism, appreciative of the ideas of socialists. He was enough in that vein that when the Russians seized the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in 1917, he was positive about that. He said, "This is a advance. This is a progressive development." Now, once they seized power and began to take action, he very quickly was chastened by that and became somewhat skeptical about socialist claims from that point onward, and became even more skeptical as the totalist projects, especially in the collectivization of agriculture, unfolded in Russia, began to impress him in negative ways. And so he became increasingly chastened in that regard. Having said that, I want to stress that what was beginning to develop in his mind was that Christians needed to be partisan, the thing I talked about last time, partisan, but in a way that did not involve strong commitments to a particular ideology, did not involve strong commitment to a particular ideology. That was hardened, I would say, in his intellectual development by the emergence of fascism and National Socialism, which he viewed from the get-go as demonic. That was the word he used. It was demonic. The National Socialist version of that kind of right-wing radicalism was demonic. And he was very specific about this, mainly because of the targeting of the Jews. The attitude towards Jews and Judaism on the part of the National Socialists, he said, was utterly heretical from a Christian point of view. Christians in relation to Jews have the relationship of a kind of sibling relationship in which Christianity is rooted in Judaism, is rooted in Jewish teachings, and Christians always have to be respectful of the inheritance that they have received from Judaism, not try to distance themselves from that, as the German Christians, the so-called German Christians did. More broadly, he was also critical of both fascism and National Socialism because of what he characterized as rabid nationalism. Rabid nationalism. He said they have turned the nation into a cause in a way that is diabolical. Very strong language. And as I said last time, once the war started, he insisted that from having been driven out of Germany, he insisted from his perch in Switzerland that what was required was that the war effort be prosecuted in such a manner that Nazism be destroyed. He was very critical of those who said, well, let's try to work out a compromise here. We can somehow control this. We can contain it. No. Barth said it is so demonic that the Christian response, he said, the Christian response, he appealed on theological grounds. This is a demonic seizure of the souls of a whole people, indeed several people. And ultimately, the challenge it poses, Nazism, not so much communism, but Nazism actually poses a spiritual problem. It poses a spiritual problem because it has great allure, he said. He said, all over the Western world, there are people who are attracted to this way of thinking, and it is seductive. And it's seductive in a way that communism is not. And it clearly represents a kind of heretical twisting of the Christian religion. Now, on that basis, he developed his own way of thinking about ideology. which is very important for the development of reform political thought. He said, ideologies, even the more moderate ones, have a tendency to take possession of people's minds. They have a tendency to take possessions of people's minds in ways that turn them into dogmatic people and a devotion to a cause which can only be characterized as idolatrous. Therefore, ideology itself poses a spiritual problem. And of course, the implication of that was that even if they drew some, as he did from socialist thinking, drew some inspiration from the ideas of secular ideologies, the important thing was to keep one's distance, and not to end up being controlled by this. By the way, there's a wonderful book by an Eastern European scholar which captures some of what Barth felt was characteristic of ideological thinking in this period. The title of the book is The Captive Mind, The Captive Mind. Well, he said all too easily, ideology becomes a kind of capturing mechanism that takes over people's lives and prevents them. Another point he made was prevents them from seeing other people, especially their opponents, as human beings. Ideological thinking veers easily, the more radical it becomes, veers easily in the direction of dehumanizing the opponent. Out of this comes in Karl Barth, and it took him a little while, but as the events I've been describing unfolded, he became increasingly, and especially in the the aftermath of the Second World War, he became a strong proponent, a principled proponent of constitutional democracy on theological grounds. He said in all kinds of ways, there is a kind of affinity, not a direct identity, but an affinity between constitutional democracy and the ethical implications of the gospel. Constitutional democracy and the ethical implications of the gospel. What are some of those implications? Well, one of the most important, you might say the most important from his point of view, is constitutional democracy imposes limits on the reach of government, limits on what it is permissible for political actors to do. And after having lived through the totalizing moment represented by totalitarian ideologies, he said it should be obvious to all of us why that's important and why it is biblical to think that that is a good thing. At one point, he actually characterized constitutional government as the pearl of great price. He also emphasized that constitutional democracy gives political rights equally to all. It doesn't marginalize any particular citizens. And another important part of it, he said, and this is where he disagreed some with those who characterize themselves as liberals, as in liberal democracy. He said, liberal democracy, when you think of democracy as a liberal project, what it tends to do is to privilege freedom over everything else, especially personal freedom over everything else. He said, I don't think that's compatible with the gospel. He said, I don't think that's compatible. He said, when you find talk of freedom in the New Testament, insofar as it's political at all, it has to do with the empowerment of believers to live lives of grace and not just legalism. But he said, when you have a constitutional democracy, it does not privilege a particular good. It does not privilege one good at the expense of all the others. Instead, it tends to produce a balance among the various different things, including justice and liberty, for example, justice and community, and so forth. He says there are multiple goods that are legitimately sought in public life, and constitutional democracy is more conducive to achieving balance among those goods than the others. And he also said that because we are fallible human beings, it is only right to ask that people, as they interact with different points of view in the body politic, accept the need for give and take, accept the need for compromise. And he characterized that as the ethic of constitutional democracy, taking for granted, I don't have the whole answer. I could be wrong. He said this is actually a theme which goes all the way back to the founding documents of the Reformed tradition. There was always an admission, we interpret Scripture this way, but we could be wrong. We could be corrected. We stand in open to the possibility of being corrected. He said that same thing can well apply and should apply to the ethos of public life. So we have here, and I hope you're sensing it as I talk, it's sort of complementary to what I said in my presentation last time. In Barth, we get the emergence of a particular way of thinking about politics, and I would say not only a particular way of thinking about politics, but a rather well fleshed out political ethic, sort of a clear definition of the approach that he believed that Christians should take to public life. Last thing I want to say is when the arrangements that I described earlier began to emerge in the aftermath of the Second World War, picking up, starting over, building grounds for stable political and economic life. On the whole, Barth was very appreciative, was very affirming of the post-war efforts. He applauded the Americans at one point. It wasn't always favorably disposed towards Americans, particularly when it came to the Cold War. But he commended the Americans in particular for their efforts to the Marshall Plan, for their efforts to invest American resources in the recovery of Western Europe on democratic terms. Having mentioned the Cold War, I just want to conclude with this observation. I said last time, and I'll say it again here, he was very, very much opposed to the division of the world into these two camps in the Cold War, and was always criticizing the attempt to reduce politics to a struggle between these two competing blocks of power. He called them power blocks, and he said those power blocks are not good for humanity, and especially as those power blocks arm themselves to the teeth, including atomic weapons. That is not something, he says, which is morally defensible. Let me stop there. Invite your thoughts, your comments.
We had one comment earlier on. I don't know how people are thinking right now. I'll give you all a minute. But John Gaffney had said nationalism, you might also mention nationalism's for its appeal. Germany's Lebensstrom and Drachnock Austin, the USSR.
Drachnock Austin.
Yeah, if you want
press to the east.
Question. Yeah, go ahead, John.
It's press to the east.
What did you want Dr. Douglas to do with this question, given what you've heard since then?
Yeah, right. I mean, Dr. Douglas then did include nationalism, but that was a big appeal, a big appeal. Certainly, actually in Italy when Il Duce took over in 1922, I think he was well received, and only later did he turn on the Jews, 1938. But whatever, and the Japanese, of course, had, who weren't mentioned here, but took over they made the puppet state of Manchukuo, I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly, which was actually Manchuria, let alone their having taken Korea and the southern half of Sakhalin Island.
But we need questions.
Yeah.
Here, Doctor. Yeah, I think Michael has a question. Michael, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Dr. Douglas, this has been fantastic. I just wanted to, 3 years ago, Kurt Peeler, who is a professor at Florida State, the head of the World War II Institute, gave a presentation to us on, I believe, Veterans Day. Veterans Day weekend. And the reason for his presentation was that he had just written a book entitled A Religious History of the American GI in World War II that the University of Nebraska Press published in 2021. It's a fascinating book from a lot of perspectives, but one in particular I wanted to sort of underline was the way in which the Army, Navy, whatever, used their chaplains. And they basically would have Catholic chaplains, Protestant chaplains, Jewish chaplains, and they would basically be assigned to units, and there would be people who were different from them in their theology. And it was an incredibly pluralistic approach. It was, you need to address the spiritual needs of these GIs, and they're going to be different from you, but you're just going to have to get over whatever your theological, beliefs are and focus on the needs of these people. And it was, anyway, it's a fascinating thing. I didn't know anything about the way that they had trained chaplains to serve in World War II, but it's fascinating to me, having heard what you just said about how that, how the impact that, well, that Marshall and FDR and others had basically already seen, that we needed to get away from this sort of hidebound, narrow theological view and be something that's more pluralistic and open. And this was during the war, and they basically laid the foundation for a lot of things that happened. Anyway, just wanted to, I didn't know if you were aware of that, but it's a fascinating book, and I guess an interesting footnote to what you've been talking about. And I'll shut up now.
Well, let me just make two observations. I was not aware of that book. I'll take a look at it. But that corresponds to my
Uh-oh, somehow you got muted. Let's see. Well, hold on just a minute. You're muted. Get to him.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry.
That corresponds to my impression. I've talked to some chaplains about this, and you have put your finger on the issue. The more pluralistic the United States became, and this was a crucial period in which the United States was becoming more aware of its pluralism, more aware of its religious pluralism. It's not far removed from the time when the United States will elect its first Catholic president. As that unfolds, there is an attempt to get chaplains to understand that their responsibilities are not just to pastor the faithful, that is, the people who are adherents to the religion they serve, but to a wider population. And that is a rather significant moment, actually, in the unfolding of American official religious pluralism. And it makes perfect sense, given the situation they faced.
John, you have a question?
Yes. Professor Douglas, first of all, thank you for coming. As a Hoya, I'm particularly pleased to hear you speak. You said a couple of things during your remarks that talked about totalism. You talked about political violence, and you talked about the different sides not being able to kind of hash things out and work things out. So my question obviously leads to the present and what you think Barth would say about the current political situation in this country from a theological perspective.
Well, given what I said at the end of my remarks about the political ethic that Barth developed over the course of his life, I think you can imagine what he would say. I think he would be profoundly worried about the recurrence of a kind of political radicalism which is totalist in its basic quality. That is, we have the truth, you don't. Therefore, politics is a power struggle and nothing but a power struggle. It's not an original thought on my part. We're hearing a lot about this to say it's not an original thought to say that there are echoes of this dark time that I've been describing in our own time. There are just too many resemblances not to ignore that. And I think all I can say is I think we find in Barth, and I tried to give you some of the reasons for this. We find in Barth strong theological support of for the kind of instincts that many of us have with respect to constitutional democracy. When he said constitutional democracy is a pearl of great price, that is my view. That is not only Karl Barth's view, it's my view, and it is threatened by political radicalism. You can't have political radicalism ascendant and the constitutional democracy project to not be threatened. So I could say more, but that's the gist of it. And I believe you me, I have been unfolding this story, not trying to be presentist, as the historians say, not trying to simply bend the story to our concerns, but simply telling the story as it's evident in the writings of these people, what they were up against, how they were responding to it. Simply by telling that story, as I've been telling it all along, it has, I think, striking resemblances in certain respects to our own time. And as I was saying to Carol at the outset, before the meeting started, you have to wonder where we are headed, given the similarities between, say, what Barth experienced in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic and what we're experiencing now. It's not the same, but there are similarities.
I'm wondering, to what extent did other Reformed churches acknowledge Barth's leadership, or did they go their own way for the most
Well,
part?
that's a great question. That's a wonderful question. To what extent did well, first of all, the Reformed churches are, they're around the world, millions of them. And of course, they were very important to European politics at this time, less important now, but very important at that time. It was not uncommon to have prime ministers and leaders of parliamentary factions to be Reformed Protestants in a number of countries. Barth's views at the time he expressed them were very controversial. They were very controversial for two reasons. Number one, just briefly to review something I said last time, he develops a new way of thinking about the fundamentals of Protestant theology in reaction to the complicity on the part of many Reformed Protestants and many Protestants generally to the war efforts that were unfolding in the First World War. He reacts against that, and he says that's wrong. And speaks very, very strongly in a very partisan way, arguing that if you read the book of Romans in particular carefully, you can't possibly support that kind of war effort that's going on there, which is sort of very extreme nationalism. Those people who were supporters of the theology that he was attacking, of course, they were not sympathetic. They were hostile to this. And so you had a debate on that front in Reformed churches about whose theology is right. Barth was the upstart. The churches were controlled at that point largely by people on the more, he would say, liberal side, who had views that were all too easily amenable to things that he disapproved of. But then on the other side, there was a right wing, especially in the time of the National Socialist period in Germany, who wanted very much to baptize National Socialism on Christian grounds, the famous German Christian movement. That was the target of the Barmen Declaration. We will not go in that direction, said said the Barman Declaration, mainly Barth's work. They were, needless to say, very, very offended by Barth. And so you might say on both the right and the left, Barth is a controversial figure. And what happens in this period is that Barth becomes the leader of a movement which gradually marginalizes the others. So, but it's just to summarize the story, it's by the time of the end of the Second World War that his kind of theology increasingly is ascendant, especially in this country, especially in the United States. It's ascendant, and the others are driven to the margins. Believe me, Carol, that's a short version. But this is
Yeah, well, I can only imagine what the situation was with, you know, the entire international situation as well as.
I would say just one other thing. This was what always happens when you get an established theology challenged by some upstart. You get division, you get controversy, and if the upstart prevails, a new orthodoxy is established.
Okay, wow. So, do we have one last question? Or are we?
Just a follow-up on that. I guess it's impossible to know the counterfactual, but was his ascendancy of his views, Karl Barth's views, post-World War, practically because of the world wars and the devastation it created? I mean, is there any situation where his theology or his views could have become dominant in absence of this utter, like, you guys destroyed our world, basically?
Yeah.
And, you know, that in discrediting that approach.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's another wonderful question, and a wonderful question always tempts me to give another lecture, which I won't. But
I
but
apologize.
I wonder, did it have to take a nuclear, explosion of, whatever? Go
Yes,
ahead.
okay, I mean,
Yeah.
well, Barth said the following about that. He said, look at the Bible, look at this, especially at the Old Testament, with Israel going up and down and facing this crisis and that crisis. He says, very often crises are the sort of the situation out of which people learn things that they had a difficult time learning any other way. And people who are sympathetic to Barth say Barth was a kind of creative response to a very difficult situation that otherwise would have been made worse for the churches. Once they had this theology, they were in a position to act creatively. Let me add one other thing about this, just very quickly. In the civil rights movement at the beginning in this country, starting in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people were drawn to that movement because of Barth and Barth's example. They even construed it to be, I think, a little bit exaggerated, but they even construed it to be something of a Barman moment. That is, this racist problem that we've had in the United States has been going on long enough. We've got to confront it. And of course, Barth's message always was, you've got to be politically engaged and you've got to be partisan. Well, that was kind of a ground out of which you could easily develop frankly, I think it's one of, I'll just add this comment. I think in the history of American Presbyterianism, the affirmative response at the national level to the civil rights movement on the part, particularly of the Northern Church, not the Southern Church, was one of the greatest moments in the history of American Presbyterianism, because they really did rally to support that movement.
Well, on that note, we can't thank you enough. We're so looking forward to the last part of this series, which fortunately or unfortunately does have some real similarities to the types of things that we're facing right now. But your scholarship and approach, we totally are very so grateful for, as we try to understand what did happen in the past as we deal with the current situation. So thank you, Dr. Douglas. Thank you so much. We'll be back. Did you have one word is about what's coming next week?
Yeah, what's coming next week? One of my favorite authors, I'm going to be talking about the Great Depression, and the title of his book on it is Into the Abyss. So on that happy note,
Okay, well,
Have a
thank
good
you.
week.
I'll see you next
Thank
week.
you.
Thanks. So, it's, yeah, I'm done.